that they said it was a bird strike. But this airplane, and I've covered aviation before, has no hallmarks of a bird strike. What it does have hallmarks of is very distinct punctures on the fuselage of the aircraft. Of this Russian missile technology, the missile doesn't actually strike the aircraft. It explodes outside the fuselage, sending a lot of shrapnel into the aircraft. Airlines should not be flying when there's verified conflict on the ground.
Russian air defense or bird strike? What really happened when the Azerbaijan airline plane crashed in Kazakhstan? There is a conspiracy theory, there are details, there is an investigation underway. There are theories from Russia, from Ukraine, and from various quarters in the West. But what really happened and what could happen in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war nearing the end of the year? To discuss all this and more, I'm being joined by Michael Bociurkiw, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Eurasia Center. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. He's been with us online, but this is the first time he's in our studio. So welcome to the India Today Global
Great
Studio.
to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with the plane crash. There are theories, there are conspiracy theories, there are investigations that are underway. And we have voices coming in from the West. Russia is saying something, Ukraine is saying something. But Michael, what according to you really happened?
Sure. Well, of course, with any plane crash, we have to be careful because best left to the investigators after they've analyzed all of the evidence, including the black boxes. But I think there is one theory that we can discount, and that's what came from the Russians, is that they said it was a bird strike. But this airplane, and I've covered aviation before, has no hallmarks of a bird strike. What it does have hallmarks of is very distinct punctures on the fuselage of the aircraft. And I mention this because they're very similar to the ones we found when I was with the OSCE in Ukraine in 2014, when a Malaysian Airlines 777 was shot down by a Russian Buk missile. Same thing. And a lot of this Russian missile technology, the missile doesn't actually strike the aircraft. It explodes outside the fuselage, sending a lot of shrapnel into the aircraft. So the missile kind of has a signature, if you will, telltale signs. Now, the black boxes will tell us airworthiness of the aircraft, the final seconds of what was said in the cockpit, whether the crew was acting properly. But the other strange thing in all of this is the plane couldn't land due to weather, but it diverted quite a distance away. You would have thought Russian-controlled territory would have been allowed to land. Some observers out there say that the Russians were trying to get the evidence as far away as possible. Maybe the plane would crash into the sea. Now, one last thing, if I may, what's going to happen the next few days, my theory is, knowing what we do of the Russian playbook, is I expect the Russian PR machine to go into overdrive, as it did in the aftermath of MH17, point the finger at the Ukrainians and say it was their fault. They were sending drones our way, we had to take an evasive action, and in the fog of war, this tragedy happened.
But for now, they've not admitted to having taken down the plane. They're still maintaining that it's bird strike. Now, for our viewers, to understand what really happened was that the plane was going from Baku to Grozny, that's Azerbaijan, to Chechnya, and got diverted, like you said, not to a close-by airport, but to Kazakhstan. And they sought an emergency landing in Aktau airport. But even before they could land, the plane had crashed. Now, Michael, what I'd like to understand is that this is not an international airline where you had people from various countries. This is, most of them were Russian. So why would Russia do that to its own citizens?
Well, if I wanted to answer that in a very cynical way, I guess, is that this would then not be the first time the Russians have executed their own people. This has happened before. We remember those apartment building bombings a long time ago. There were actually, I think, altogether 3 or 4 different nationalities. let's say that, again, in the chaos of what ensued with these drones in the air, with Russia trying to take them down, that airplane was in the wrong place at the wrong time. On that point, I will say this: the airspace should have been completely closed. And that's not only I'm pointing the finger at the authorities on the ground, I'm pointing the finger at a lot of people. Even when M817 came down in Ukraine, the airspace was only closed to a certain level. M817 was 2,000 feet above that closure. Should have been closed all the way. And countries aren't doing this enough. And in addition, airlines should not be flying when there's verified conflict on the ground. And that's what happened as well in that tragic crash of Ukrainian Airlines PS752 in Tehran. There was missile activity going on big time. And yet that plane, the airline decided to take off with tragic consequences. So there are a number of factors here, but again, I think the Russians will try to point the blame elsewhere, saying that, see, this is what happens, the Ukrainian drones came here and with tragic consequences.
Surprisingly, there are survivors. In a crash, most of the plane crash that we've seen, there are rarely survivors, but here of the 62, 38 casualty, and the rest have survived. So
yeah, incredible, isn't it? Because that was quite the fireball. What we do know is the plane was whole from the video when it was coming down. And that's the other factor here that will provide a lot of clues to the investigation is the survivors. I mean, they will be interviewed they have cell phone video that they took inside those horrific final minutes when the plane was coming down. One thing we took from there was we saw that there was decompression, the air mass had deployed, and a lot of fear. And then also, as in many recent crashes, including that one in Tehran I mentioned, these are different days. People have cell phones, they're taking videos, they're posting on social media. So that will all come into play. And this is going to be extra important in this one because the plane, as you referenced it, crashed in Kazakhstan. They do have a relatively close security relationship with Moscow. I'm sure the Russians will want to get in on this investigation. A key next step will be who will be the authority designated to decode, download the black boxes. The data black box and also the cockpit voice recorder. The leaders in that regard are France and the United States. So hopefully the Kazakhs will say we want a full, transparent international investigation, and including by the participation of the Brazilian manufacturer of the aircraft, and we'll get to the bottom of this.
Some of the American media reports, as also European media reports, have already started coming out and citing sources within the intelligence community saying that it is Russia that was involved. But explain to us the timing. Why now?
Why now?
Isn't everything sitting pretty for Russia as of now with Trump going to take over?
Yeah.
Why would they have to do this now?
Well, none of us are saying this was a deliberate act from the Russian side. There's an active conflict going on, and things do happen, mistakes do happen. In fact, the Iranians, if we're to believe them, said that we did not intentionally shoot down PS752, the Ukrainian airliner. It was done because it was mistaken for a missile or something like that.
So blaming Ukraine for the drone activity, which is what they would be they were focusing on, and instead got.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that just from some gut feeling. I'm saying because based on the way they acted with M817, with really solid evidence pointing to the fact that it was a Russian missile, well, what did the Russians do? They manipulated data. They had press conferences which gave out these ridiculous theories, but all of these acts on the part of the Russians pointed to the Ukrainian side. That's their playbook. That's what they do. And the problem I have with this as well is, like in the case with M817, these investigations take a while. The Dutch did an incredible job finding out what exactly happened. But what happens when a certain party to the conflict seizes the narrative and goes with it? That is what a lot of people remember, and that's unfortunate. So the thing with plane crashes, and again, I've covered a lot of them, and I worked the one with the OSCE, is time is your best friend with these things. You take your time to determine what happened and don't jump to conclusions. So that's why I'm being a bit careful with you. But the other thing, just going back quickly to the bird strike issue, from what we've seen, for example, that U.S. aircraft that got hit by bird strike coming out of LaGuardia Airport and had to ditch in the Hudson River. It did not fly for very long. They had to ditch immediately. Whereas this airplane kept on flying, I believe it was 70 more minutes or something like that. So that's where we see the difference in the theories here.
Okay. Now the larger picture.
Sure.
We are nearing the end of this year and the war continues. It's been a very long drawn war. Has fatigue set in? What are you looking at?
Yeah.
Michael is based out of Odessa in Ukraine. So for somebody who's seeing the war very closely, at close quarters, and has been in touch with the Ukrainians as to what they are doing. But are you seeing fatigue set in within Ukraine?
I am, and like you said, I've lived there since even before the start of the war, first in Kiev, then in Lviv, but mostly in Odessa. So you see things in very granular ways. You basically lived the war. And there isn't one front line in this war, near the eastern Donetsk, Luhansk front line. It's actually throughout all of Ukraine right now because of the amount of Russian drones and missiles coming into the country. A lot of Ukrainians tell me we now feel, especially in the recent strikes from Russia, that no inch of Ukraine is safe. The reason for that being, of course, is air defense systems. The most robust ones in the world cannot defend a territory that big. But, Odessa, where I'm based, is really, it's a city built by many different nationalities. It's a port city. It's people regard themselves as very tough there, as very resilient, very entrepreneurial. And they're also symbols of what I call irrepressible resilience. Having said that, after almost 3 years of war now, a lot of them are becoming tired. There is a big issue, for example, right now with small and medium-sized businesses. A lot of them cannot find manpower because so many have either volunteered or they've been drafted to the front line or have moved abroad. And then secondly, because of the power outages as a result of Russian strikes on critical infrastructure, generators have to be purchased, diesel for these things, and that adds to your costs a lot. And a lot of people just don't want to go out anymore. Some men, actually it's probably in large numbers, are not going out because they're afraid of being apprehended on the street by military officials and conscription taken to the front line. The Russians know exactly what they're doing. For example, they're striking the power plants when the cold snaps happened. Just before I left Ukraine to come here, that's exactly what happened. We were below 0 Celsius. That's when some big strikes happened. And you don't only lose light, you also lose water in some cases and heating. And because Ukraine is such a digitalized society, data signals evaporate after a few minutes. So it's very difficult for people working remotely, for students, distance learning. Schools, the kids have to go to bomb shelters during the alerts. McDonald's closes, banks close. So a number of really big disruptions. And finally, Kyiv is very severely affected right now. Most nights there are drone and missile attacks. The alarms are set off, and people have to go to bomb shelters and they don't sleep. It's very difficult to survive in those circumstances.
Politically speaking, what is the situation in Kyiv? Now, for our viewers again, Ukraine has been very unique in its politics. Mm-hmm. It has had governments that is pro-West or pro-Russia.
Correct.
And every time there's change in administration, the policy shift happens drastically so. So they've had a pro-Russia government in the past, and for the past 10 and now the third term, more than 10 years, they've had a pro-West government, with Zelensky taking over only last time around.
Yeah.
And in such a scenario, when there is a war and a country is invaded, Russia invading Ukraine, everybody, including the opposition, rallies behind the leader that is in place currently. But slowly, with fatigue setting in, people questioning Zelensky, is the political atmosphere changing? Not just within Zelensky camp, but also the opposition.
Yeah, a few factors here. Number one, I will say, and I covered Zelensky's campaign when he came in, it was amazing, and he beat Poroshenko hands down, and I think a big reason he won is that he addressed what people wanted to hear. Those were economic issues. And he changed a lot of things. And no one predicted the war would go the way it has. But I can't think of anybody else who would have made such an incredible transition from basically a comedy actor to a wartime president who is really revered the world over. I think Mr. Putin miscalculated him or underestimated him.
Yes.
He thought Zelensky would be a pushover. In fact, he tested his will at the beginning. I believe there was a POW exchange. But he's proven that he's a man of his word and stealth. Having said that, there are concerns about what's happening recently, the centralization of power within the Zelensky administration. That anyone who becomes a little bit too popular or perhaps even a bit outspoken gets sent off to another embassy perhaps, or gets cashiered, as we say. And I think that's what happened with the very, very popular former foreign minister of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba, who I believe you've met. Very articulate, and he was welcome in most capitals around the world. But he was unfortunately moved on and replaced by someone who hardly meets the qualifications needed right now. The other thing is a lot of Ukrainians will tell you, including those who have moved abroad in huge numbers, there's not one war, but there's two. There's the legacy of a war from before the war, that is the war on corruption. And Ukrainian media has gone through a very tough time with this war, as you might expect. A lot of people have had to go fight, volunteer, immigrated. The advertising market has collapsed. But yet, we still have very good investigative reporting going on. And they're still unveiling absolutely jaw-dropping examples of corruption, of people benefiting from the war, absolutely sickening numbers in the millions of dollars, which indirectly result in soldiers losing their lives at the front line. There's a lot of pressure on the administration to crack down on that more. The reason for that is if they don't, those millions of Ukrainians who left, especially the young ones, will say, well, I'm not going back to the Ukraine I left, where there's corruption going on at a massive scale, and I don't blame them. So it's really, really important that this continue and that the administration, which came in on a huge majority, including the parliament, puts through still legislation to crack down and make the penalties a lot more severe than they are now. The other thing viewers might be reminded, useful to remind them of, is that Zelensky only promised to run for one term. Because of the war and martial law, elections cannot happen, and they shouldn't, because it's not even safe to have a proper election.
There cannot be a transition.
Yeah, but I think it'll be important to him, and hopefully in 2025 we will see an end to the war and peace, that I think that he'll pretty quickly call an election, and but I'm not quite sure whether he'll run again. His popularity ratings were taking quite the hit in the past 2 or 3 years, I'd say. So I'm not quite sure he would run again.
Okay. You spoke about peace, so let's talk peace.
Sure.
Jan 20th, Trump takes over. Is that going to be the moment where he will ensure that that at least the war comes to an end? But the compromises maybe for Ukraine would be huge in terms of land and having to give up certain parts. Would you agree?
Yes, I mean, the one thing that President Zelensky is faced with, I mean, the losses on the Ukrainian side have been absolutely huge. I think the last quoted figure by the administration was 30 or 40,000. Most Western observers believe it's double that on the Ukrainian side. And, you know, the loss also of millions and millions of Ukrainians to overseas. And so he has a huge responsibility on his shoulders to not enter into negotiations rapidly where he's pressured to give things away. And there's a lot of pressure on him right now from some Western capitals to meet Putin at the peace table, at the negotiating table, and make a deal. But he realizes more than anybody, you can see it in his face, that the losses are really weighing on him, and he would be sacrificing or betraying, I would say, those families who have had losses if he enters a deal where, for example, Russia is demanding that they take Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblasts in their entirety.
Is Dnieper going to become the natural boundary?
Yes, that would pretty much make it. And also, we should remind people that the Russians also have control of the biggest nuclear power plant.
They're not giving that up.
They're not giving that up. Secondly,
in fact, Putin thinks it was a mistake having given it up, in the first place at all.
he thinks it was a mistake dissolving the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And that's what the Poles know, and the Estonians and everybody else in the neighborhood, is that if he is not stopped at the border between Ukraine and Russia, he will go further, and he will. We can see even now, in subtle ways, through their hybrid warfare, they're testing the will, probing for soft tissue, whether it's cutting submarine cables in the Northern Sea, or also Baltic Sea, or meddling in elections, or assassinating opponents on foreign soil, or even Russian drones and missiles transiting Moldova, Romania to get into, in Poland to get into Ukraine. These are all tests to see what the reaction will be for the West. So he feels he can get away with a lot. Now with Mr. Trump, he did say that when he's elected within one day, he will bring an end to the war. Well, I believe he was elected in November. We're now at the end of December. Maybe he'll say, okay, I meant...
But for him, day one would be Jan 21st.
Right, exactly. So he is someone who does make huge promises and claims, but backtracks. But he's also someone who likes to be projected or seen as the master of the art of the deal. So why not use this to make his big first deal? I think what's going to happen is he will go to Mr. Putin first and say, what do you want? And Putin will say, I'm not lowering my bottom line. I want these 4 oblasts. Of course, Crimea is ours. He'll probably ask for that demilitarized zone. And the big one for Ukraine is to back off of its bid to become a member of NATO. That won't fly with the Ukrainians, of course. Then I think we're now seeing signals from the Trump team that they have softened their stance on aid to Ukraine. So if Putin doesn't agree to what Mr. Trump wants to hear, Trump will go to Zelensky and say, okay, we're going to give you everything we need. Everything you need, go for it. And then we'll see what happens. But
interesting.
Yeah.
So both sides will have to weigh in their options and navigate Trump very carefully in terms of their responses, else he might choose one side or the other.
Right.
So it's going to be a very interesting few weeks from now. But this is the end of the year. Not much hope in terms of peace by the end, but hoping that 2025, Michael, brings in some semblance of sanity, normalcy,
Absolutely.
and peace yet again.
And of course, that would be great for everyone in terms of waking up peacefully in the morning with your family in Ukraine or wherever you are, but also, I have to say, economically, because what happens in Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world, pretty much, the Black Sea is not functioning very well right now. Ukraine grain is not getting out there, and that will affect a lot of people.
It has impacted.
Ordinary people in Egypt who can't afford bread anymore because grain prices have gone up. So we have to remind people of that oil domino effect. Yeah.
Energy. Prices have gone up. Inflation is at its peak. And all this because of the wars and conflicts we're seeing across, and many other factors, but this certainly is a very important factor. Michael,
Indeed.
Thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global, sharing your perspective. We'll keep calling you back.
Thank you.
To understand what's happening on the Russia-Ukraine front, as also how Europe is going to deal with the crisis should the wars not end.
Sure.
Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thank you.